Hello everyone. In today's video, we are going to talk about the muscles of the pharynx. But before we do that, let's quickly revise what the pharynx is. Now we know that the pharynx, it is a musculofascial half cylinder that links the oral cavity and the nasal cavity in the head to the larynx and the esophagus in the neck, being a common pathway for air and food. Now if we zoom into this diagram for a bit, we would notice that this is the pharynx. It forms the posterior wall of the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and the laryngeal inlet. We also notice that its walls are related anteriorly to the lateral margins of the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and the laryngeal inlet, and that it is attached superiorly to the base of the skull, and inferiorly it is continuous with the esophagus approximately at the level of the 6th cervical vertebrae. Now, if we look at this diagram, we would see that the pharynx is subdivided into three regions. The nasopharynx, which is posterior to the nasal cavity or the nasal apertures, the oropharynx, which is posterior to the opening of the oral cavity or the oropharyngeal isthmus, and the laryngopharynx, which is posterior to the superior aperture of the larynx or the laryngeal inlet. Now coming back to the C-shaped wall that we had talked earlier of, we see that the pharyngeal wall, posterior to these three regions, it is composed of skeletal muscles as well as fascia, and wherever the skeletal muscles are absent, it is reinforced by the connective tissue. Now the muscles of the pharyngeal wall, they are organized into two groups based on the orientation of the muscle fibers. So here we see that the first group of fibers is the circular constrictor muscles, and the second group is the longitudinal muscles. Now coming to this diagram, you can appreciate the pharyngeal constrictors, which are the superior, the middle, and the inferior pharyngeal constrictor, and the longitudinal muscles, which are the Palatopharyngeus, Stylopharyngeus, and the Salpingopharyngeus. Now the circular muscles or the pharyngeal constrictors are oriented in a horizontal manner to the pharyngeal wall, while the longitudinal muscles are oriented in a vertical manner. Now coming to the pharyngeal constrictors. Now we know that there are three pharyngeal constrictors, which are the superior, the middle, and the inferior pharyngeal constrictor. And we also know that they are major contributors to the structure of the pharyngeal wall. Now anteriorly, these muscles attach to bones, cartilages, and ligaments related to the lateral margins of the nasal and oral cavities. So we've already seen it in this diagram that anteriorly and posteriorly they are attached to different bones and ligaments, whereas posteriorly all of them are joined at the pharyngeal raphe. So the pharyngeal raphe, it is a cord-like ligament. So basically the two sides of the pharyngeal constrictors, they are welded together in the midline in this manner. So the fibers are projecting this way, and they're welded together in the midline by a vertically oriented cord-like structure. And this extends from the pharyngeal tubercle on the base of the skull to the level of the 6th cervical vertebrae, where the pharynx is continuous with the esophagus. Now apart from that, we see that the constrictor muscles are arranged in a manner that they overlap each other, and all of the constrictors are innervated by the pharyngeal branch of the vagus nerve. So as you can see in this diagram, this is the way flower pods are stacked on top of each other. So similarly, we see that the inferior constrictor overlaps the lower margin of the middle constrictor, and the middle constrictor overlaps the lower margin of the superior constrictor. Now apart from that, all of these muscles, they are innervated by the pharyngeal plexus through the vagus nerve, carrying the fibers from the cranial accessory nerve. Coming back to this slide, let us highlight what we have studied so far. We have studied that there are three constrictor muscles on each side, Anteriorly, they are joined to the lateral margins of the nasal cavity, oral cavity, and the larynx. Posteriorly, they are welded together at the cord-like ligament, which is the pharyngeal raphe. All of these muscles are arranged in a way that they overlap each other, and all of these are innervated by the pharyngeal plexus of the vagus nerve. So from here, coming to the superior constrictor, we see that this forms the upper bracket of the pharyngeal cavity. Okay, it arises from the pterygoid hamulus, the base of the skull, the pterygomandibular raphe, and the adjoining part of the base of the mandible. Right? From here, the muscle fans out posteriorly and joins its partner muscles at the pharyngeal raphe. Right? So we knew that the insertion of all the muscles was at the pharyngeal raphe. So one side joins the other at the same, and it originates at the pterygoid hamulus, the pterygomandibular raphe, and the adjacent bone of the mandible. So an interesting thing that we see here is the presence of the palatopharyngeal sphincter. Now this is a special band of muscle that originates from the anterolateral surface of the soft palate. Now, when we were studying about the muscles of the soft palate, we also saw that the tensa veli palatini, it winds around the pterygoid hamulus, forming the palatine aponeurosis, right? And we also saw that the levator palati was related to the palatine aponeurosis. So in the similar manner, from the soft palate arises a palatopharyngeal sphincter, which circles the inner aspect of the pharyngeal wall. So you would realize that when this muscle constricts, it forms a prominent ridge, and a ridge means basically closing the pharyngeal wall, right? So it functions to constrict during swallowing on the deep aspect of the pharyngeal wall, and in this manner it helps close the pharyngeal isthmus between the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. Now moving forward to our middle constrictor. Now in the middle constrictor, first of all, we see that it overlaps the lower margin of the superior constrictor, and also that it is related to the stylohyoid ligament, which extends from the styloid process to the hyoid bone. It is related to the lesser and the greater cornu of the hyoid bone, right? So it's originating from the lesser and the greater cornu of the hyoid bone, and similar to the superior constrictor, it fans out posteriorly to attach to the pharyngeal raphe and join with the muscles on the other side. So here you can see the points that I've highlighted. Attaches to the stylohyoid ligament, the greater and the inferior cornu of the hyoid bone, posteriorly attached to the pharyngeal raphe, overlapping the superior constrictor. Finally, coming to our last constrictor, which is the inferior constrictor, we see that these are our last set of constrictors, right? Anteriorly, we see that they originate from the oblique line on the lateral lamina of the thyroid cartilage as well as the cricoid cartilage. The muscle fibers then fan out and they join the pharyngeal raphe posteriorly. Now, superiorly, they are related, they overlap the lower margin of the middle constrictor, and inferiorly, they blend with the wall of the esophagus, also forming the narrowest part of the pharyngeal cavity. Now it can also be studied in a way that we divide the muscle fibers into two groups, which are the Thyropharyngeus, those arising from the oblique line on the thyroid cartilage, and the cricopharyngeus, which arise from the cricoid cartilage. Now an important point relevant to this is the presence of the Killian's dehiscence or the pharyngeal diverticulum. So we'll study about that when we complete with the longitudinal muscles. Another important point that I want to mention here is that all the superior constrictor, the middle constrictor, and the inferior constrictor muscle, they basically narrow or constrict the pharyngeal cavity. So a sequential contraction would allow the bolus of the food to move from the top to the bottom, right, towards the esophagus. So from here, moving on to our longitudinal muscles, we have again three muscles, which are the Stylopharyngeus, the Palatopharyngeus, and the Salpingopharyngeus. Now all of these muscles are named according to their origins. So you can see that the Stylopharyngeus, it originates from the styloid process of the temporal bone. The Salpingopharyngeus, it originates from the cartilaginous part of the pharyngotympanic tube or the auditory tube, right? It extends from the middle ear to the nasopharynx. So the Salpingopharyngeus, it originates from the cartilaginous part of the pharyngotympanic tube, and the Palatopharyngeus, which originates from the soft palate. Now their function is to elevate the pharyngeal wall, right, because of their vertical orientation, and pull up the pharyngeal wall up over a bolus of food being moved through the pharynx. So when we were talking about the constrictor muscles, we saw that when they contracted, they narrowed the pharyngeal inlet. When the longitudinal muscles contract, they pull up the pharyngeal wall. Now starting with our first longitudinal muscle, the Stylopharyngeus. It originates from the medial surface of the styloid process and descends between the superior and the middle constrictor to fan out and blend with the deep surface of the pharyngeal wall. So let us see it in this lateral section. This is the Stylopharyngeus muscle originating from the medial wall of the styloid process of the temporal bone. Descending downwards, it fans out and merges with the deep wall of the pharyngeal wall. Now this is the only muscle which is supplied by the pharyngeal branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So all the other muscles of the pharynx are supplied by the vagus nerve. However, the Stylopharyngeus is supplied by the glossopharyngeal or the ninth cranial nerve. The next muscle we have is the Salpingopharyngeus. So as the name suggests, salpingo means tube. So this is a muscle originating from the inferior aspect of the auditory tube and ascending on, blending with the deep surface of the pharyngeal wall again. The last muscle we have is the Palatopharyngeus, as you can see here. Now if you can recall, the Palatopharyngeus was also a muscle of the soft palate, right? We had studied there were 5 muscles in the soft palate, and 2 muscles descending from the palatine aponeurosis were the palatoglossus and the palatopharyngeus. So palatopharyngeus is also a muscle of the pharynx, and it is attached to the upper surface of the palatine aponeurosis, passes posteriorly and inferiorly to blend with the deep wall of the pharyngeal wall. So you can see it in this diagram as well. This is the palatopharyngeus muscle. It arises from the palatine aponeurosis, descends posteriorly and inferiorly to blend with the deep surface of the pharynx. So this is the palatopharyngeus. Now this is a diagram from my muscles of the soft palate. So if you want to watch that, I'll link that in the description as well. So now coming to our fascia of the pharynx, right? So when we were talking about the prevertebral fascia, I also mentioned to you 2 fascias, which were the buccopharyngeal fascia and the pharyngo-basilar fascia. These were the modifications of the deep layer of the fascia, right? Now what we see here is that this is the cervical vertebra and this is the passage of food, right? So anterior to the vertebrae, the first layer we have is the buccopharyngeal fascia, okay? And anterior to that is the pharyngo-basilar fascia. Between the pharyngo-basilar fascia, which forms the inner lining of the pharyngeal wall, and the buccopharyngeal fascia, which forms the outer lining, we have the presence of the skeletal muscles. And all of this is lined internally by the mucous membrane, right? So let's go over this once again. The buccopharyngeal fascia is a thin layer that coats the outside of the muscular wall. Then we have the muscular wall, and then the pharyngo-basilar fascia lines the inner surface of the muscular wall. The entire pharynx is lined by a mucous membrane internally. Now apart from that, we see that the fascia reinforces the pharyngeal wall where the muscle is deficient, right? So between the base of the skull and the superior constrictor, we can notice a gap. And also between the 3 constrictors, there is a potential gap. So the fascia reinforces the pharyngeal wall wherever there is a deficiency of the muscle, and above the superior constrictor, it is reinforced externally by the muscles of the soft palate. So between the gap between the base of the skull and the superior constrictor, we also see the muscles of the soft palate, which are the tensor veli palatini and the levator veli palatini. Here you can see them. Now from here we come to the gaps between the pharyngeal muscles and the structures related to them. We'll discuss this in the next video when we talk about the nerve supply and the arterial supply as well. So thank you so much for watching this video. Let's just quickly revise what we have studied so far. We studied that the pharynx forms the posterior part of the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and the laryngeal inlet. It has three regions, which are the naso, oro, and laryngopharynx. The pharyngeal wall is made up of the skeletal muscles and fascia, and the muscles are arranged in a circular and a vertical manner, being called the constrictor muscles and the longitudinal muscles. We see that the the constrictor muscles are composed of the superior, middle, and inferior, overlapping each other. They are attached posteriorly to a cord-like ligament, which is the pharyngeal raphe. We saw that the constriction of the constrictors in a sequential manner allows the bolus of the food to move from top to bottom. We saw that the superior constrictor, it arose from the pterygoid hamulus, the pterygomandibular raphe, and the base of the mandible to the pharyngeal raphe. We saw the palatopharyngeal sphincter was present in the anterolateral surface of the soft palate, forming a ridge, closing the pharyngeal isthmus. We saw that the middle constrictor arose from the lesser and the greater cornu of hyoid up to the pharyngeal raphe. And we saw that the inferior constrictors, they were two in number, which were the Thyropharyngeus and the cricopharyngeus, which arose from the oblique line on the thyroid cartilage as well as the cricoid cartilage. In the longitudinal muscles, we saw the first one was the Stylopharyngeus, coming from the medial wall of the styloid process and descending downwards between the superior and the middle constrictor. We saw the Salpingopharyngeus was related to the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube, and the Palatopharyngeus was related to the soft palate. Then we saw that the fascia of the pharyngeal wall could be divided into two layers, which were the external buccopharyngeal fascia and the internal pharyngo-basilar fascia. Between them sandwiched was the muscular part, or the skeletal muscle. Then we also saw wherever there was a gap between the fascia, the walls, it was reinforced by fascia. So with this, we conclude this video. In the next video, we'll talk about the gaps as well as the nerve supply of the muscles of pharynx. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.